Given current policy settings, I think a recession in the US is not the probable outcome. It's becoming increasingly plausible that the Fed will start to loosen. I think actually quite possibly in the first half of next year. There will be a soft landing in the US without something that looks like a recession, and inflation will fall to 2%. We're not going to have higher rates, and rates are going to start falling.
삼프로TV 시청자 여러분, 그리고 늘 삼프로TV의 컨텐츠를 사랑해 주시고 성원해 주시는 전국의 우리 투자자 여러분, 그리고 지구촌 곳곳의 우리 투자자 여러분, 오늘 또 여러분께 정말 특별한 게스트를 소개해야 될 것 같습니다. 여러분, 삼프로TV의 여러 코너 중에 글로벌 머니 톡스라는 그 코너 기억하시죠? 굉장히 많은 글로벌 투자의 구루들을 비롯해서 정말 우리가 만나보기 힘들 만큼 아주 유명하고도 또 그들의 인사이트가 정말 대단한 분들을 저희가 많이 모시는데 다 아실 겁니다. 뭐 레이 달리오도 또 하워드 막스도 오셨고 또 켄 피셔도 왔죠. 그리고 누리엘 루비니 교수도 왔고요. 그런데 그 글로벌 머니 톡스의 대장정의 첫 번째 인터뷰이 굉장히 유명한 분 기억하십니까, 여러분? 파이낸셜타임스의 마틴 울프 논설위원이 첫 번째 막을 올려주셨는데, 그 마틴 울프가 바로 저희 삼프로 스튜디오에 오늘 직접 방문을 해 주셨습니다. 이렇게 또 이런 인터뷰를 어레인지해 준 감초 같은 분이죠. 중앙일보의 강남규 스님 기자라고.
예.
선임 기자.
강남규입니다.
오늘 마틴 울프와 이런 이 자본주의와 민주주의의 위기 뭐 이런 부분에 대해서도 얘기를 나누고 또 내년도에 우리 전체 금융시장의 동향은 어떨지에 대해서도 깊이 있는 대화를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 마틴 울프 논설위원을 여러분께 소개하겠습니다. Hi, Martin.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for your time. And then, as far as I heard, you visited Korea about 51 years ago. Please tell us that story about that.
That's right. I came here in the summer of 1972. I was then 25. I just joined the World Bank. It was my first job after I completed my postgraduate degree in economics at Oxford. I applied for the World Bank. I did not expect to be accepted because there were rather too many British people there already. But I was accepted. I became a young professional. And in my first year as a young professional, they rotated one. And my second 6 months was working for what's called the Development Finance Division or Department. And the World Bank had invested in loans to the Korea Development Finance Company. And we were sent, I was a very junior member, in a team to evaluate our loans to this company. And therefore I came to Seoul and I was here for 5 weeks.
Martin, it's personally, it was a kind of surprise to me that you've come out with political related book title, Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, the topic of which seemed, at least seemed to me, not belong to economists. Why did you start write this political economic book?
Well, that's quite simple. I give 3 answers very quickly. The first is, why did I do economics at all? Unlike most people, I didn't decide to study economics when I was in Oxford because I was interested in economics for itself. And I was interested in politics. I've always been interested in politics. My father was a political journalist. My parents were refugees from from Hitler. So politics mattered to me. And I thought, if I'm going to understand politics, I obviously need to understand economics. So I went into economics because I was really interested in politics. And then I discovered I really enjoyed economics, and I proceeded to do a graduate degree and had a professional career. But my interest in economics was always about how you create economic change to give people a better life. And I didn't think of that as something separate from political and social development. It was just part of political and social development on which I concentrated. And that's why I went into the World Bank. I was interested not in economics for itself, but I was interested in development. And I always thought of development as also a political process. Of course, the two are integrated. In fact, our discussion just now about Korean politics shows that. And then, of course, recent developments have made clear that politics and economics are really very close together, because political change creates economic policy change, and economic change creates politics. So I think of what I'm doing as political economy, and that's what the founder, at least in Britain, of this discipline, Adam Smith, was doing. So I don't think there's anything surprising. What I think is the great mistake we've made is to think of economics as a discipline completely separate from all the other aspects of human civilization, human life. We live in society. Politics and culture and economics are all part of society, and I've always tried to think of them together, but right now the relationships are really important.
All right. So unfortunately, we don't have a Korean title for your book yet. So can you give us a brief summary of your book for Korean fan of you?
It's quite a big book, so a brief summary is quite difficult, but basically so it starts with the observation that in many countries we are seeing the emergence in both developing and emerging countries, and also in some of the most supposedly advanced high-income democracies, a move towards autocracy and a move towards populism, often together, and very great deal of evidence that people are increasingly anxious about, or even opposed to, democracy. They see it as inefficient, not delivering what they want. So that's the starting point. And then I think this was shown most clearly to me with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. It was pretty obvious that something profound was happening, because this was clearly a man who didn't take very seriously democratic norms. Then that allowed me to start thinking about what is democracy and what's going wrong here. And a large part of the book sort of consists of explaining the relationship between the democracy as a political system and the market economy, the capitalist economy, as an economic system. And I argue, and go into this in greater depth, that you should see them as complementary opposites. It's a sort of core idea, which means that it's really impossible, I argue, and this is also consistent with experience, to have a democracy without a market economy. A fully socialized economy will never support a democratic system. So these two things go together, and historically, democracy as we know it emerged out of a market economic system. We started with a liberal economy, and that, I argue in my book, generated social revolution and economic revolution and intellectual revolution that led increasingly to a demand for political rights. But a central element of it was the idea, which I think is also relevant in these societies in East Asia, that we don't have ascribed status anymore. The idea was that every individual, which is fundamental to the market economy, has the right to make the best life they can for themselves. And the fact that they're not born as nobles, they're not born as aristocrats, they're not born as serfs. Everybody in this sense has equal status. That's a very profound social and cultural idea, and of course it has political implications as well. Once you accept that in the economy, you start to say, well, if they have the right to do what they can in the market economy, make money for themselves. They also have a right to a say in the polity, because these are egalitarian ideas. The problem with the market economy, it doesn't generate necessarily egalitarian outcomes, and it doesn't necessarily generate equality, as it were, of resources. Of course it does, it's obvious. And if you're not careful, you can start developing a political system which is essentially plutocracy. And once you get to that system, then you tend to get a tension, and Plato already wrote about this 2,500 years ago, between the plutocrats or the oligarchs on the one hand and the people who then wish to get somebody to defend them from those forces, cultural or other dominant forces, by seeking a demagogic leader. And that's an old idea, and that tension is a core part of my book. And then I go into essentially looking at why did the economy evolve in a way that created this interplay between plutocracy and autocracy, why what particular things were important there, how bad has this relationship become across the world, but particularly in developed countries. And then I have a long discussion of what one might do to reinforce the sense that people are all part of one social and economic organism in which political rights can be balanced by economic rights, and we get a prosperous democratic capitalism again, which we have been losing. So, as briefly as I can, that's what this book is about.
Oh, so we've done reading his book.
No, I promise you there's a lot more in it. This was a very brief summary of a rather big book, I'm afraid.
Okay. How about the new event, the Argentinian's president-elect, is Javier Milei? He is known as a kind of ultra super right wing
populist.
How did you find the fact that he is elected?
Let me just say something about populism.
Okay.
The way I define it, and this is based on my reading and thinking about it, all populists are against existing elites.
Oh.
Okay, that's a defining character. That's what you mean by a populist. Who the elites are that they're against varies, and which elites they sort of focus on varies, but it's perfectly possible to be a free market person, as Mr. Milei is, and to be a genuine populist, because in Argentina, for the last 70 years roughly, the dominant power has been the Peronists, who control the state. So to be a populist means you're against the state bureaucrats, you're against the politicians who corrupted the state, and there's no doubt they were. So Mr. Milei, in that sense, is a genuine populist, but being against the elites is perfectly legitimate in democracies. You might decide that the elites are corrupt and incompetent, and they need to be changed. So I have no problem with this. Indeed, I point out in my book, it's a very important point, that if you look at his speeches, and the most important populist, quote unquote, demagogic leader in a major democracy in the 20th century was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a populist. So that's just so populism is a style of politics. It's not a political philosophy. And that's very important. It's a style of politics, an anti-elitist style of politics, which tends, because it's appealing to the people, to be demagogic, to make people hate the elites, as it were. But this is not inconsistent with democracy unless it becomes, and this is a point I've learned from a very significant German scholar who teaches at Princeton, called Müller, is that it's not really lethal unless it becomes anti-pluralist. When it becomes anti-pluralist, what people are then saying, and Mr. Trump sometimes says things like that, is that the whole groups of society who are not legitimate members of society. They're people who have no place in society. That can vary, but often it's foreigners or immigrants. That's particularly important in Germany in the 1930s, it was Jews. They were not legitimate parts of society. So there's an anti-pluralist element. And that's very clearly part of what Trump is about. He says certain sorts of people aren't really part of the people at all. And we had that in a bit in our Brexit campaign. That then moves into really severe authoritarianism. Now, this comes back to Mr. Millet. He has proposed a certain sort of economic policy. It's not anti-pluralist. He says everybody can participate on this. So I don't think of what he's doing as inherently anti-democratic as such. I think something quite different, which is I don't believe the program that he has put forward as it is now defined will work. That's an economics judgment. I think some of it could work, and we will see how it plays out. Now, if he introduces this program in the present form, I think it will cause a pretty colossal depression in the short run. And that will create political ramifications, backlash. So the question is, what happens then? People start protesting, they will, in enormous numbers. There will be huge demonstrations. The population is equally divided. If he's not very, very careful, what he's proposing could start a civil war. Now, if that happens, then democracy will be in terrible trouble. So it's here, I would say, he got into power legitimately. He put forward a program which was populist, as I've said, but where it goes now depends very much on how things play out. And here there's a really crucial point, which is democracy is government by consent. That's fundamental. And it's a government in which you don't suppress the people who disagree with you, and it's government in which the people who are elected are legitimate. Now, the problem arises if you have a program so extreme in some ways in terms of this polity that it causes immense unrest. Can you sustain the consent, peaceful consent, or do you end up in a civil war? Obviously, I define in one neat phrase I have, democracy can be defined as a civilized civil war. I mean, democracy is clearly a sort of civil war in the sense that you've got a government and an opposition, you argue fiercely, you disagree profoundly, and at the end you have to accept that all this must be done peacefully, and whoever wins is legitimate, and the people who've lost accept this. So it's a civilized civil war. Now, the danger comes, of course, if people don't accept defeat, which is where Trump is so dangerous, because he hasn't accepted defeat. And then you start moving to a situation in which there's a real risk of a coup, of violence, something like that. So we will have to see with Mr. Millet and with other such leaders what happens if huge parts of the people say, we do not accept what you want to do. And that could happen, and then you've got that's democracy in crisis.
Okay, Martin, let's talk about a little bit more about liberal democracy and market capitalism. You call the relationship between these two a difficult and fragile marriage. What makes you say that?
The fundamental idea in democracy is the equality of political status. Right? So everybody has the vote. Everybody in principle has the power to mobilize political forces, to create parties, win elections, and become the leader. So you need independent market system to support democracy. It also creates, I think, the prosperity on which, out of which forces are developed, which mobilize themselves. You need resources to mobilize yourselves for politics. So that's where it works well. If the economy can do two things that undermine democracy. One, it can create immense inequality. And immense inequality means immense concentration of resources in relatively limited hands. And those people will use their resources to control politics, and then they cease to be democratic. And they become much less democratic. They become oligarchic or plutocratic. The other side is, as you've got rising inequality, the mass of the people will come to feel, particularly if the economy doesn't work very well, this system isn't working for us. Yes, we've got the vote, but we're not getting rising incomes. All the increased incomes are going to a small group of people at the top. They actually manage the politics between them. They control the politics. This isn't really democracy at all. And then we've seen this many times. They turn to demagogues of the left or the right who will say, we will clean it all up. We will deliver for you the opportunities and the prosperity you think you deserve. And they have different ways of framing this. So it's a relationship in which the two sides need each other. I've got much more of that. But it's fragile because you are trying to bring together a political system which is inherently highly egalitarian with an economic system which is not necessarily so. And under certain circumstances, they can fight each other.
Let's expand our discussion to the broader global economy. I think a lot of people in South Korea as well as over the world, they confused next year situation, economic situation, especially U.S. economy, what's going on next year. How do you expect U.S. economy next year?
And I've written about this very recently, the view that the landing will be fairly soft has become significantly more credible. So the way I've put this is there's sort of two questions here. What will happen and what needs to happen? And they are separate and people confuse them. So as things are at the moment, it looks as though the economy still has very strong momentum. Monetary policy, there is clearly some lagged effect of past monetary tightening to come. There's clearly some risk that the household sector's savings are being run down. So this will weaken demand. All these things will weaken demand. But most analyses to me that are credible suggest this will not lead to a recession. There will be a slowdown, but not a real recession, which is complicated to define.
You don't expect a recession?
But I don't, given current policy settings, I think a recession in the US is not the probable outcome. It's obviously possible. I also think that it's becoming increasingly plausible that the Fed will start to loosen in the course, I think actually quite possibly in the first half of next year, but certainly by the end of that period. And it seems quite plausible. So we've got peak tightening. And so there are more, that means negative shocks will be offset in this sense by positive ones, which is we're not going to have higher rates and rates are going to start falling. So, and then the question is, what looks like happening? In Europe, I think it'll be worse, but it won't be dramatically worse. And I'm assuming that China will keep going so that it won't be the old China dynamism, but at least it will keep going at somewhere between 3 and 5%. Now, will that be enough will what I've described be enough to lower inflation to 2%? That's what the question of what needs to happen is relevant. So 2 years ago, I would have said they will need a recession to bring inflation back down to 2%. Now, if I look at what's been happening to inflation, inflation pressure, wages even, labor markets, it looks much more plausible to me, not certain, much more plausible that inflation will go back to target without needing a huge recession. Because it looks as though inflation is falling and the labor market is normalizing without a really big rise in unemployment, simply because vacancies are falling. So I think the idea that there will be a soft landing in the US, and they don't need a hard landing in the US either, these two have come together to make me somewhat more optimistic that the US will get through the next year without something that looks like a recession, and inflation will fall to 2%. But it should be stressed, there is no certainty in these things. We are watching a process with these huge inflation spikes and enormous pressure on the economies, with very low unemployment and high employment, that its unwinding is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's very different from what's happened in previous recessions, in previous inflationary spikes and subsequent recessions. So we can't be confident, but I'm pretty optimistic now that this will pan out quite well for the US, and that will sustain a lot of demand in the world too.
Have you ever seen any historical parallel without recession? Disinflation have been succeed?
It's a very good question, and I certainly don't know all the examples, so I'm quite interested in economic history. And it's partly a matter of definition of what a recession is. So a recession is not really strictly speaking, a scientific concept. And people talk about 2 negative quarters. But that's not how they're actually defined. In America, as you know, a recession is defined by the National Bureau for Economic Research, the NBR, and it's quite subjective. So defining whether or not what we're going to have is a recession or not may not be helpful. So I tend to think of it as a big growth slowdown. Mm-hmm. We will see a period in which actual growth is below potential growth. So that means by definition that there will be rising slack in the economy. And the proposition I'm making in that sense, it's an important slowdown. But the proposition I'm making is that this rising slack might show itself, as it has been so far, mostly in reduction in excess demand for workers showing up in vacancies, particularly in changes in quit rates, things like that. It looks to me now more plausible that you can have it work through these relatively benign ways mostly. There might be some rise in unemployment, not so large. And it appears that that might work, because you're still reducing excess demand in the labor market, to lower inflation significantly in the context of this slowdown, rising slack, without the symptom of recession which people worry about most, which is a really big increase in unemployment. I think that looks more plausible. Now, will that actually work out? Has that ever happened before? Well, since the catastrophe, the big disaster of the 70s, when things really went to hell, and that's the thing, if you look at the tightenings that have occurred, for instance, in the early 90s, there was a slowdown, quite significant. It wasn't a very big recession. It was pretty mild. And what makes it different this time, and this is why all things are different, is inflation this time was much higher. So that was much worse than anything we've seen in the West since the 1970s. And that's why I thought they would need much more tightening than they have. But at the moment, it is beginning to look as though the slowdown they're going to have, and it is a real slowdown, will affect the economy and lower underlying inflation, particularly in the labor market, without causing a really big rise in unemployment. And that may be because the conditions this time are in important respects different, and that's what makes economics, macroeconomics, sort of so much a matter of judgment, because every given recession and every given inflation spike is somewhat different. And in this case, such a huge part of it was these immense external shocks. And they were happening in an economy which was really quite flexible compared to the 70s. So it does look as though it is a bit different, but it's not so dramatically different, except I think in this way that the way the labor market slack is working through. So that has made me more optimistic. But it's still going to be a slowdown. That means it's crucial. There will be a slowdown, and it may turn out that actually, retrospectively, we will see it as a recession. I don't expect the world economy in the next 12 months, and this is crucial, to be very strong. That would seem that would be really rather surprising. Monetary policy is really rather tight. And as inflation falls, real interest rates rise. And that makes borrowing more expensive, and there will be less of it.
Let's talk about the global economy a little bit more. This year, 2023, actually, U.S. economy is way better than we expected. But Chinese economy is way worse than we expected a year ago, because we expected the reopening effect, something like that. So, next year, 2024, how do you think about that? Similar or different?
Well, people tell me they still expect really growth this year over last year to be 5%. So it's not that bad. And it's more or less what people thought. Now, last year was bad. Of course, that was the closing closed down well, because you can say 5% after the COVID shutdowns year of 22 is pretty poor, but it's still a fair growth rate. If that's point one. Point two, I think most of us think that the quality of Chinese statistics has deteriorated. And it's worth remembering that Li Keqiang, the late Li Keqiang himself, reminded us famously that he didn't really trust Chinese GDP statistics, even if I knew exactly what the GDP figures are, that there are quite good reasons to believe that Chinese growth over the next few years, and perhaps much longer, will be much weaker than we've been used to in the past. And there are at least three factors here, many of which are long-term. These are the headwinds. Right? First, well, the trade war with the US is bound to have some effect on optimism, investment, trade growth in some sectors. How big that will be, I don't know, but it's clearly, I don't think it's the biggest of these things, but that's clearly one factor. More broadly, many outside observers are arguing the animal spirits of the private sector have been somewhat damaged, and that means that investment by the private sector is likely to remain weak by historical standards. And of course, the growth rate has clearly slowed, and one reason to invest so much in China has always been to get ahead of very rapid demand growth. Well, if demand growth is actually 4% instead of 7 or 8, that's a big difference in terms of how much you invest. So that's number one. General private sector animal spirits linked in part to the trade zone. The second thing is, I think there is a long-term structural change in the real estate sector. The rate at which investment in real estate expanded, its role in generating demand in the economy and debt in the economy was clearly unsustainable. I've been arguing this for years. It's finally, I think, happened. Final point about the growth is China now has a shrinking labor force, and productivity growth has certainly slower than it was 20 years ago. So if you add this together, Optimistic Chinese observers, whom I think are really good, would say potential growth in China is not much above 4%. And then there are these cyclical factors. So let's say that 4% is a reasonable optimistic view, 4.5%. But there's a downside risk because of these really big structural shifts out of the property sector to somewhere else. And there's a question, of course, of the policy actions they take. So I tend to think we should assume that China will not grow more than about 4% a year, whether that will be next year, over the rest of this decade, probably slowing as the demography gets worse. Of course, it is crucial to remember the economy is twice as big as it was 15 years ago. So even 4% growth is a lot of economy, and it will therefore remain a very big source of demand in the world economy.
In that, under that expectation, so can you tell us the relationship between two countries, the U.S. and China, is tougher or?
So assume that this administration remains in power. They will continue to be pretty watchful about trade in products which they see as sensitive from a security point of view. That's been particularly true of microprocessors, semiconductors, so forth. There will be no general strategic decoupling, not as a general policy. They will make quite a big effort, as they seem to be now, to cool down the tensions, to contain the tensions, but they won't go. It's clear from the meetings between Biden and Xi that they are trying to avoid it's getting much worse, because they know how dangerous this could be on both sides. And so trade between the US and China will not be particularly dynamic, but it's not that gigantic for either side. And of course, there's lots of other markets for China and anyway. And of course, Chinese products can end up in the US indirectly by going through other countries like Vietnam, being incorporated into products that are made in Vietnam and then end up in America. So it's very porous. So basically what I'm saying is the most likely outcome is it's going to be a workable relationship with workable trade relationships one way or another, provided the players remain who they are now. So I'm relatively optimistic about this. Because I think people have worked out that decoupling is unworkable and a complete breakdown relationship is absolutely unworkable for them and the world. Okay, you get the final product from, I don't know, Mexico, Vietnam, whatever it might be, but they still have to use Chinese inputs. And remember, China is far and away the biggest manufacturing country in the world. It's almost impossible to avoid using Chinese inputs. So I don't think decoupling was ever workable. So that's the optimistic scenario. Now, what happens if Donald Trump comes in, I don't know. But it's clear he has announced that his plan is to impose a across-the-board tariff on everybody. I think his announcement was about 10%. That's going to be quite a nuisance. But it's not going to be about China. It's about trying to decouple from the US from the rest of the world in some way. Now, 10% across-the-board tariff is not itself that disastrous. But of course, I expect retaliation. So other countries will follow. And the US might then retaliate against the retaliation. This is what happened in the early 30s. So with this return Trump, if that happens, we are in a completely unpredictable world in which he basically says all the commitments the US has made, because all these tariffs are bound within the WTO, they don't count anymore. We're just going to do whatever we like. And I think there will be retaliation, and it will affect world trade quite profoundly, and it will generate enormous uncertainty for business. It'll be very bad, clearly, for a country like Korea, small, open, very open economy. So then we would not really be talking about the US versus China. That's a part of it. It's really about something different, which is a US decision to go isolationist. That is what Trump is about. But he will be president if he's president, and he can do a lot. Well, there's actually a big question whether this is constitutional, by the way, because in the US Constitution, trade policy is a responsibility of Congress. So we don't even know, so it creates a political and constitutional crisis. So one possibility is a perfectly manageable world, I think. And the other possibility is a journey into the unknown, which we haven't seen in any way since the 1930s. And I find it impossible to predict how that will play out. I really have no idea.
Trump is uncertainty.
Trump is uncertainty, indeed. That's the point. And uncertainty for business is the worst thing, because all business involves making long-term commitments, even if you're not long-term commitments to suppliers, long-term commitments to investments, and if you've got these complicated supply chains,
the financial market, the investment,
and the financial markets will then put in a huge risk premium, and investors will have a risk premium, and corporate managers will have a huge risk premium, and that's really bad for economies.
Actually, it will be my last question for you. As far as I know, you are mid-70. You studied a lot, and you have a lot of experience about economy as well as everything you experience, right? So, how do you think about the word? Is progress?
So at the end of this, I tend to the view that you recognize the problems, you're realistic about the problems, and that's the necessary condition of tackling them. But I believe that in the end, humanity will find a way through all this. But I don't think it's helpful to deny that we have had some pretty big problems, but progress in the end. Worth remembering, we've had the biggest declines in poverty in the last 40 years ever. Mm-hmm. There are fewer desperately poor people in the world now than ever before. Our technology continues to advance quite amazingly and brilliantly. Back in the 70s, I worked on India for the World Bank. And in the 70s, India grew about 2 or 3% a year, and that there was no development. Per capita GDP was essentially stagnant. And it's not China now, but it's now, GDP is growing at about 4% a year. That's pretty dramatic. So I would say the world's a better place, and I'm basically an optimist.
So thank you very much. We hope to see you soon, Seoul as well as London.
London.
Thank you very much.
자, 삼프로TV 시청자 여러분, 마틴 울프와의 저희 세 사람의 대화가 여러분들에게도 굉장히 큰 도움이 되셨기를 바라고요. 저희 삼프로TV는 앞으로도 마틴 울프와 같은 또 인사이트가 있으면서도 또 우리에게 굉장히 큰 도움을 줄 수 있는 이런 세계적인 석학과 구루들을 찾아서 또 열심히 한번 달려보겠습니다. 다음 인터뷰를 기대해 주시고요. 끝까지 시청해 주신 여러분 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.